Continuing my series on World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, we now come to Israeli World War II tanks. Now, obviously, Israel itself didn't exist during World War II, but it did use a lot of World War II tanks from a variety of different nations, so these are the tanks that we will be looking at today. The Israeli tech tree also operates differently to other tech trees, like, say, the Chinese tech tree that we looked at before, in that it starts off at rank 4. Which puts Israeli players at a disadvantage compared to other players who will have had 3 previous ranks to level up their crews and gain experience in the game, giving them an edge over Israeli players. So adding World War II tanks will also allow for the Israeli tech tree to start at an earlier rank, which should offset these issues. And you'll also see that, like the previous episode looking at Chinese tanks, most if not all of the vehicles in this episode are from foreign nations, but often with major modifications carried out by the Israelis. So we're going to start off by looking at Israeli light tanks, starting with the Hotchkiss H39, which was a French tank from the early World War II period. Now you might wonder why Israel would bother obtaining tanks that would have been considered long obsolete for the modern battlefield, but you have to remember that their enemies in the First Arab-Israeli War were not exactly the best equipped with regards to tanks themselves. So even tanks that were outdated by major power standards were more than adequate for Israeli needs. You also have to remember that there was an arms embargo placed on Israel by the United Kingdom and United States. So Israel couldn't rely on these nations, and indeed Czechoslovakia was a notable supplier of arms and aircraft to Israel in this time period. But with regards to tanks, Israel couldn't afford to be picky about what tanks it acquired, as these often had to be smuggled into the country in secrecy. This was also the case with the H39, with 10 of these tanks being acquired from France on the 26th of March 1948, a month before Israel's independence, and these cost $41,000 each, or about $551,000 in 2025, with these being smuggled into Israel in 1948. These tanks will mostly be identical to the H39s already in game, but some of these H39s appear to have been fitted with a German cupola, indicating that those tanks were used by France in 1940, captured and modified by the Germans for their use in World War II before being recaptured by France and sold to Israel, giving them a rather interesting history and the potential for us to get 2 variants of the H39 in the Israeli tech tree, with perhaps the cupola version being a rank 1 premium and the regular H39 in the regular tech tree, or vice versa. The only other possible difference is in the performance of its 37mm SA-38 gun, as the initial 2000 37mm shells that were delivered were all HE shells, which are also missing in game, thus forcing the Israelis to modify some of these shells by fitting the heads from American 37mm shells, which might make a small difference with regards to in-game penetration, which is currently 36mm at 500 metres with the SA-38's current APC shell. As for the rest of the stats, they will be the same as the regular H39, being armed with the 37mm SA-38 gun, a coaxial 7.5mm Mach 31 machine gun, a maximum armour of 40mm for the hull and 45mm for the turret, a top speed of 22.7 miles per hour or 36 km an hour, and a 2-man crew. In-game, this would make for a good starting 1.0 tank for the Israeli tech tree on the second from left line, having decent armour and speed and an OK armament, but being let down by its 2-man crew and use of solid shot shells, but regardless I think this would perform decently well at tier 1. In real life these tanks weren't the best performing, with these being worn out from many years of use in World War II by the French and sometimes German forces, resulting in many breakdowns, with only 6 actually being brought to operational service during the First Arab-Israeli War. Then to make things worse, during an attack against Egyptian forces, 4 were knocked out by mines or anti-tank ditches, forcing their abandonment. Following this, the remaining H39s had their guns removed and placed on various armoured cars, ending their use as combat tanks but allowing them to fight on in a sense. However, one H39 survives to this day at the Armoured Corps Memorial Site and Museum at Latrun, now restored to its original configuration with the 37mm SA-38 gun. It should also be mentioned that some French Renault R35s were given to Syrian forces in 1946 by the French when Syria gained its independence, with these being used by Syrian forces in the war against Israel, resulting in at least 2 of these being captured by Israeli forces. It doesn't seem like Israel made great use of these tanks, but in theory they could be added, though unfortunately they seem to use the shorter barrel SA-18 37mm gun, which can only penetrate 24mm at 500 metres or 33mm at 100 metres, with a model 1937 APCR shell. A performance so bad that most of the tanks armed with this gun were removed from being researched until you at least reached rank 2 of the French tech tree. Besides this, it would also have a top speed of just 12.4 mph or 20 km/h, a two-man crew and a maximum armour thickness of 45mm for the turret and 43mm for the hull. If added, this could be another starter vehicle for the Israeli tech tree on the far left line, having decent armour but a bad gun, a slow top speed and would be vulnerable due to its two-man crew, but it would be useful for boosting rank 1 lineups. Lastly, for light tanks there was the M22 Locust, these being American tanks that were being kept in a British-controlled depot, with 26 of these being demilitarised and sold as scrap in 1948 to the Delta Trading Company, which as it turns out was an Egyptian front, allowing the British to sell these tanks while not technically breaking the arms embargo. However, it seems that they either weren't demilitarised very well or the Egyptians managed to repair and rearm them, as they used them in December 1948 against the Israelis, who knocked out a number of these tanks and managed to capture 9 of them. The M22 would make for a good improvement over the H39 and R35, being armed with a far better 37mm gun, capable of penetrating 73mm at 500 metres with its M51B1 APC-BC shell, while having a top speed of 35 mph or 56 km/h and a 3-man crew. In fact, the only major downside of this tank is its thin armour, maxing out at just 25mm, though its fast speed and low silhouette should help in avoiding enemy fire. This would make for an excellent light tank after the H39 at 2.0, having a good gun, top speed, and being more survivable from the extra crew member, and I think this would perform very well in the Israeli tech tree. In real life, the Israelis managed to repair a number of these tanks and put at least 4 of them into service, with these serving until the early 1950s, and at least one still survives to this day at Negba in Israel. So we can see that Israel had a large number of light tank types in service at various points, though only the 10 H39s were available for the Arab-Israeli War, and only 6 of them were in a serviceable condition. There were talks with Czechoslovakia to buy 22 LTVZ-38s, more commonly known as the Panzer 38E, but the Czechs wanted $90,000 per tank, and even after dropping the price to $75,000, this was still far too expensive for the Israelis, being almost twice the price of the already not particularly great H39, so this deal never went through. There would also be attempts to buy the M5A1 Stuart light tanks, with 38 of these being brought, but due to the American arms embargo on Israel, these would have to be smuggled out of the United States, and unfortunately for Israel, before this could happen, the FBI found and confiscated these tanks, so they never actually entered Israeli service. Moving on from light tanks, we can now look at medium tanks, starting with the M4 Shermans, and we have a lot of Israeli modified Shermans to look at. The story with the Sherman in Israeli service starts at the beginning of the war, as British troops were being withdrawn from the region, with equipment that couldn't or wasn't worth taking to be destroyed or made inoperable, including a British M4A2 that was supposed to be destroyed to prevent its use in the war by the various combatants. However, by bribing a British soldier, the Haganah, one of the main militias fighting in the war that would later become part of the Israeli Defence Forces, managed to acquire the tank, which would eventually be named Mir and brought to Tel Aviv for tests and repairs. However, the tank was in a bad state, with most of the components not working and the gun unable to be fired, which required major repairs, but despite this the gun still couldn't be fixed, leading to its replacement by a 20mm Hispano-Suiza 404 autocannon, the same as used on the TCM-20 anti-air vehicle in the Israeli tech tree. Unfortunately for us, in-game its armour-piercing tracer shells can only penetrate 35mm at 100 metres, which would make this mostly unsuitable for adding in-game. Unless placed at the very early tiers and used as an early Jumbo Sherman type tank, being hard to take down from the front but very limited in its offensive capabilities, though I don't think Gaijin would add it in this guise. Fortunately for us, the Israelis managed to buy 3 75mm M3 cannons, with one of these being fitted to Mir, giving us a Sherman tank for use at 4.0 at rank 2, the same as the regular M4A2 in the American tech tree, and making for a good starting medium tank in the far left line of the Israeli tech tree. However, with only a handful of tanks available and just one Sherman, Israel would still need more of these tanks, which led to a mission in August 1948 to scour various scrapyards in Europe for tanks that could be acquired. After much looking, Israel managed to acquire 30 M4 Sherman 105 tanks from a scrapyard in Forlì in Italy, for the low price of just $2,200 per tank, or about $29,500 in 2025, with these being delivered to Israel from November 1948 to January 1949 in 3 shipments. Unfortunately for the Israelis, these tanks had been successfully demilitarised, with a hole being drilled through the barrel of the guns to prevent their use. Attempts were made to fix these guns, but only one could be fixed at the time, with another 2 being refitted with the previously mentioned 75mm guns, these being named Tamar and Ruth II, but leaving 27 tanks that would need to be rearmed if they were to become useful combat tanks. There were debates on what weapons to fit, but eventually it was settled that the M1903/22 Krupp field gun would be fitted, as a batch of these guns had just arrived from Switzerland. These had originally been sold to Romania by Krupp before World War I, before in turn being sold to Switzerland, which is good for us because, as you can see from the various digitisation requests I've made with them, I really like the Swiss Federal Archives, and in my opinion they are some of the easiest and best to look through when looking for information. So here is the document with all of the shells that could be fired from the M1903/22 while in Swiss service, including the usual shrapnel, smoke, and the Stahlgranate shells, which are HE shells and not solid shell AP shells as one might expect based on the steel projectile translation, but right at the bottom we can see a Panzergranate 1941 shell, which appears to have an explosive filler of 118 grams. Unfortunately we aren't given any armour penetration figures, but we are given the weight and velocity of the round, which we can plug into Gaijin's armour penetration calculator, which gives us a maximum point-blank range penetration at 0 degrees of 72mm. So 12mm worse than the AP shell from the 75mm M2 on the M3 Lee, 7mm worse than the APC-BC shell used by the Italian P40, and actually 9mm better than the APHE shell from the Swedish Stridsvagn M42. So it's not the best shell in the world, but it's certainly no slouch either. However, to complicate things for us, the fuse appears to have been fitted to the base of the shell, which on Italian shells sometimes causes them to act like HES shells, which might complicate its effectiveness, though for simplicity I think it would be added as a regular APHE shell. Lastly, for the armament, as this is fitted to the M4105, it will retain its slower turret traverse of just 4.2 degrees a second, which will make responding to enemy flanking attacks more difficult, while the in-game M4A3105 also has a better elevation of 35 degrees versus 25 degrees for the 75mm armed variants, though I doubt this will have much effect in-game. Other than the armament, the rest of the stats should remain the same with a 5-man crew, top speed of 24 miles per hour or 39 kilometers an hour, and a maximum armour thickness of 76mm for the turret, and 50mm for the hull. I think this could work in game at 2.7, the same battle rating as the M3 Lee and the Stridsvagn M42, as its gun will be able to deal with most enemies effectively at this battle rating while not being overpowered. And while its armour might be a problem for some enemies, it should be easy enough to flank this tank while giving us a good tier 2 tank for the Israelis. In real life, the conversions of these Shermans weren't even decided on until December 1948, with the first of these entering service in April 1949, which was too late for them to see action in the war as various armistice agreements had been signed with Egypt on the 24th of February 1949, Lebanon on the 23rd of March and Jordan the 3rd of April. And while Syria wouldn't sign one until the 20th of July, most of the fighting would have been over by this point. These Krupp Shermans didn't stay in service for very long, with them being withdrawn at the end of 1951 in order to be fitted with 105mm howitzers, bringing them back to their original states. So by mid-1949, Israel had quite a few Sherman tanks in service, with 75mm armed Shermans being designated M3, regardless of whether it was placed on an M4, M4105, M4A1, M4A2, M4A3 or M4A4 Sherman, while the Krupp Shermans would have the 105mm howitzer refitted, making them M-4 Shermans, and with the end of the war Israel would start to acquire more tanks, including Shermans with the long 76mm gun. These were usually based on the M4A1 or sometimes the M4A3, and these were designated the M1 Sherman, unless fitted with the HVSS suspension, in which case it was the M1 Super Sherman, which was a bit odd to read as that designation in the public eye is usually associated with the later M50 and M51 Shermans. Though in real life I suspect the latter tanks were still given that Super Sherman name by regular soldiers and civilians, regardless of the official designation. Sort of like the Jagdpanzer 38T versus Hetzer designation. Talking of the M50, I will cover it briefly here, then in more depth when looking at Cold War tanks, but basically this came about from a collaboration in the mid-1950s between France and Israel to upgrade their Sherman tanks, primarily by fitting the 75mm SA-50 gun from the AMX-13 light tank, greatly boosting the firepower and giving an in-game penetration of 180mm at 500m with its APC-BC shell, compared to 93mm for the M3 75mm gun, or 133mm for the M1 76mm gun. Initially these used a Continental engine, being designated the Degem Aleph, with about 50 Shermans converted to this standard, but the later Degem Bet variants used a Cummins 460 horsepower diesel engine, with 250 tanks converted to this standard, and this was able to reach a top speed of 26 miles per hour or 42 kilometers an hour, so marginally faster than the previous variant. Now the M50 should be relatively easy to add to the Israeli tech tree, as we sort of already have it in game in the French tech tree as the M4A4 SA-50 at tier 3 battle rating 5.0, and if added to the Israeli tech tree it would make for a good tier 3 medium tank before reaching the M51, and it would be a good way to expand the Israeli tech tree beyond tier 4. In real life the M50 would first see combat in the Suez Crisis in 1956, while also seeing combat in the Six-Day War in 1967 and Yom Kippur War in 1973, with reducing effectiveness as time went on, before being withdrawn fully in 1976, with some supplied to various Lebanese militias, or sold to Chile, which I covered in my episode on Chilean tanks. There would also be another variant of the M50, the Degem Yud, which had its whole height reduced by 30cm, mitigating a large weakness of the Sherman in how tall it is, as well as potentially improving mobility from excess weight being removed, but the rest of the stats are the same as the regular M50, and this could be a cool premium tank to have at 5.0, though I will likely look at it in more detail when covering Israeli Cold War tanks. Lastly, Israel would convert Shermans into the M51, which was fitted with an even more powerful 105mm gun, but this is already represented in game with the more powerful engine and is the starting medium tank for the Israeli tech tree, and again it's probably better to consider as a Cold War tank. However, while the Sherman is the most well known of Israeli World War II medium tanks, it also managed to acquire 2 Cromwell tanks during the First Arab-Israeli War. These were intended to be taken by British troops as they evacuated from Israel, but luckily for Israel, 2 British soldiers, Harry MacDonald and Mike Flanagan, were sympathetic to the Israelis and planned to steal 4 Cromwell tanks alongside drivers sent by the Israelis. Unfortunately, one of the tanks wouldn't start, and the other was driven into a ditch and got stuck, but Flanagan and MacDonald managed to escape with the other 2 Cromwell tanks and made it to Tel Aviv, where they joined the IDF. Now the Cromwell tanks that were taken were of 2 different variants, one being a Mark III with a 57mm 6-pounder gun, and one being a Mark IV with a quick-firing 75mm gun. Now unfortunately those Cromwell variants aren't the ones in the British tech tree, but essentially the Mark III is the Centaur Mark I hull converted to take the Meteor engine, while the Mark IV is the Centaur III hull fitted with the Meteor engine. If you're a bit confused, see my episode on British World War II tanks for the story behind the Centaur. This should allow them to act similarly to the Mark I and Mark V already in game, with the 57mm gun having excellent penetration stats, maxing out at 100mm at 500m with its APC-BC shell, while the 75mm gun has 89mm penetration at 500m with its M61 APC-BC shell, which in-game in the British tech tree is a solid shot shell, but potentially Israel might have had access to the American rounds because of their access to the American 75mm guns, so potentially they might have shells with explosive filler within them, which will help with post-penetration damage. And both tanks also have a 7.92mm bow and coaxial machine gun. As for the rest of the stats, these should be broadly the same as the Cromwell, with a maximum of 76mm of armour, a top speed of around 40 mph at 64.3 km/h, and a crew of 5. In-game, these could probably be added at the same battle rating as their Cromwell counterparts, with the Mark IV at 3.3 and the Mark III at 3.7, probably on the second from left line of the Israeli tech tree, and these would make for a good counterpart to the Israeli Sherman tanks, being faster and lower profile than the Shermans while also having good guns, but with flat-sided armour that does make them vulnerable in a fight, but I still think they would be a good addition to the game. In real life, the Cromwell tanks and MacDonald and Flanagan fought during the First Arab-Israeli War, with the Mark IV named Miriam and the Mark III Ruth, and despite sustaining damage, including the 75mm gun from the Mark IV being disabled by a makeshift HE shell, both tanks survive at Latrun to this day. Israel would also capture a large number of T-34-85s from the Egyptians, and it seems there was some consideration on adopting them, as they were used for testing and training purposes, but ultimately these weren't adopted by the IDF and don't seem to have been used as combat tanks. That said, if they were added they could go at 5.7, either in the main tech tree or as a premium tank. A few Panzer IVs would also be captured, this time from the Syrians, these generally being GH and J variants, though some had an amalgamation of features from a variety of different variants, and these were often modified to take the DSHK machine gun on the roof. Some of these Panzer IVs still survive in Israel today, though these were not used as combat tanks by Israel, but then again neither was the ZSU 57-2, and that was added to the Israeli tech tree, so maybe we could see these tanks at 3.3 to 3.7, probably as premium tanks, though I personally would rather they not be added. Of course, as well as tanks, the Israelis also operated tank destroyer and SPG vehicles, including the American M10 GMC. So the story here seems to be that the Israelis, wanting to boost their armoured forces after the 1948 war, acquired roughly 101 M10 tank destroyers from France, with these originally fitted with the American 76mm M7 gun, though these were often in bad shape. However, this purchase was carried out at the same time work was being done on fitting the 75mm SA-50 onto the M50 tanks, so it was decided to carry out a similar conversion to the M10. With a large number of these vehicles converted, with these also bizarrely being called the M50, which does cause some confusion. However, it was realised that it was better to use the more powerful 75mm gun on the Sherman tank, so these M10s were used for training purposes. However, this isn't quite the end of the story, as during the 1956 Suez Crisis, Israel would capture many Egyptian Archer tank destroyers, along with their 17-pounder guns, and vast quantities of ammunition. Not wanting to keep the vehicles but seeing a use for the guns, the 17-pounders were fitted to the remaining M10s, and were again used for training purposes. So this gives us 3 potential variants, with 2 being relatively easy to add, with the initial 76mm armed variant and 17-pounder variant being added in a folder at 3.3, the same as their M10 GMC and Achilles counterparts. Meanwhile, the 75mm SA-50 variant could also be added at 3.3, or maybe 3.7 at a push, as its best APC-BC shell penetrates 180mm at 500 metres, only 8mm more than the 17-pounder's best APC-BC shell, while the American APC-BC shell penetrates 133mm but has an explosive filler, making the SA-50 variant not that much of an improvement, though it does have a better muzzle velocity of 1000 metres a second, 117 metres a second more than the next fastest shell. Other than that, it would share all of the other stats, having a slow-turning open-top turret, thin armour, a top speed of around 30 mph or 48 km/h depending on what chassis was used, and a 5-man crew. I think these would make for good Israeli tank destroyers, with the first 2 variants given a choice between sheer penetration and post-penetration damage, while the SA-50 variant would in theory have the best penetrating weapon, and it would be nice to see these variants in the Israeli tech tree in War Thunder. In real life, these vehicles were mainly used for training until 1966 before being retired. And one of these tank destroyers that had the 17-pounder still exists to this day and is now operated by the World War II Armour Organisation. Israel would also use half-tracks fitted with anti-tank weapons, including at least one half-track fitted with a British 57mm 6-pounder gun, which the Israelis named Ruth. This would likely operate much the same as the Su-57 in the Soviet tech tree, though there might be some differences depending on if it's using the M3 or M5 half-track. But overall it would have a very hard-hitting weapon, but it would be lightly armoured and it would have a top speed of around 42 to 45 miles per hour, again depending on if it's an M3 or M5, while a crew of 5 seems to have been carried. Overall this would make for a good tank destroyer at 2.3, having a hard-hitting weapon while limited by the lack of armour and turret, but it will make for a good ambush vehicle for the Israeli tech tree. There would also be other weapons fitted to half-tracks, including at least one Krupp gun apparently tested out on a half-track, though this appears to have been a one-off example, but other half-tracks were also fitted with other weapons such as howitzers. The Archer tank destroyers captured from the Egyptians probably shouldn't be added, as they don't seem to have been used by the Israelis, but as mentioned, the same is true for the ZSU-57 too, and as mentioned that's in the Israeli tech tree, so the Archer could in theory also be added at 2.7, though again I would personally be against that. Stug 3s with the long 75mm gun and Su-100s operated by the Syrians and Egyptians respectively would also be captured by the Israelis. These were not integrated into IDF service, but if Gaijin did decide to add them for whatever reason, the Stug 3 could be added at 4.0 and the Su-100 at 6.0, though again I personally don't think these vehicles should be added to the Israeli tech tree. The Israelis would also acquire a number of M7 Priests in the 1960s, these being armed with a 105mm howitzer that in-game can penetrate 27mm with its HE shell or 130mm with a H shell, while smoke shells could also be carried. A 12.7mm machine gun is also carried for close-in defence in a sort of pulpit position, which is where its nickname comes from, while its top speed is about 26 miles per hour or 42 kilometers an hour, 7 to 8 crew could be carried, and armour technically maxes out at 108mm, but is generally 50mm or less for most areas, and the fighting compartment is open-topped, making it extremely vulnerable to aircraft and HE shells. In-game, the M7 Priest could probably be added at around 2.7, giving Israel a good artillery vehicle with useful HE and H shells, but suffering from the open-topped nature of the fighting compartment, which does make it vulnerable to almost all enemies. Lastly, there would also be the Sherman MAR 240, which was a Sherman chassis fitted with a rocket launcher that could launch 36 240mm rockets, which could make for a cool premium tank, though again I will properly cover this in the Israeli Cold War tanks episode, as this was a conversion from after the Six-Day War in 1967, so barely counts as a World War II tank. There would also be attempts to buy 12 Jagdpanzer 38Ts from Czechoslovakia, but like with the LTVZ-38 tanks, the price was too high for these vehicles, being $75,000 per vehicle, compared to $41,000 for the H-39s, so Israel didn't go through with this purchase. So moving on from tank destroyers, we now come to armoured cars, with us having quite a few options here, starting with the M3A1 White Scout car, which has been modified and given a turret, with this armed with the 37mm SA-38 gun taken from the French H-39s that we looked at earlier. As mentioned then, the 37mm gun penetrates 36mm at 500 metres with its APC shell, an okay performance, while a machine gun is mounted at the front of the hull, giving some good defence against soft-skin vehicles. It also looks like more armour has been fitted to the vehicle, providing protection against small arms fire at the very least, though likely not much else. While its top speed before the modifications was 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers an hour, though I suspect this may have been slowed down by the modifications, and it could originally carry up to 8 people, though I suspect 3 to 4 crew would be a more likely number in-game. This could make for a good starting armoured car at 1.0, having an okay 37mm gun and good top speed, but being vulnerable to enemy fire, though this is the same for many other armoured cars, and I think it will do well in a scouting and hit-and-run role. Following from the M3A1, there would be a similar conversion on captured Marmon Harrington Mark IVFs, as the examples the Israelis acquired often had damaged or non-functional 40mm 2-pounder guns, resulting in at least 2 examples being fitted with the 37mm SA-38 gun, which is significantly less powerful than the 2-pounder, again penetrating 36mm at 500m versus 49mm for the 2-pounder's APHE shell, which is also the worst performing in regards to armour penetration, with its best shell capable of penetrating 77mm at the same range, double that of the SA-38. The Mark IV-F is also different in that it is built on a Canadian Ford 3-ton truck chassis, but it should broadly have the same stats as the Mark IV, with a top speed of 52 mph or 83 km/h, a maximum of 12mm of armour, a crew of 3 and 2 machine guns, the usual 30 cal in the coaxial position and one on the roof, while I haven't seen any smoke discharges like that on the in-game Mark IV. In-game this would probably be a 1.0 armoured car, preferably folded with the M3A1, being slightly better protected but having very similar stats compared to that vehicle, but it would still be a very good addition for War Thunder. The Israelis do also seem to have acquired Marmon Harrington armoured cars with their 40mm 2-pounder guns still operational, and these could be added at 1.3 like the in-game Mark IV, giving a good upgrade from the previous 37mm armoured vehicles. And then sticking with British armoured cars, at least one Daimler armoured car was used by the Israelis, with its standard 2-pounder gun appearing to be intact. So again, this could be added at 1.3 like the Daimler Mark II in the British tech tree, maybe as a premium vehicle or alternative successor to the Marmon Harrington armoured cars. And this would perform much the same as in the British tech tree, though again in the pictures I've found I haven't been able to see the smoke discharges, so that might be missing unlike on the British example. Then going back to American armoured cars, we have this rather unusual example of an M5 half-track with 2 turrets. There wasn't a lot of information on this vehicle until the last decade or so, and I believe these photos originate from an old War Thunder forum post by Cade. But as you can see, this half-track has been heavily modified by fitting a turret from a Daimler armoured car and the mantlet from a Humber armoured car, while the main armament is now the American 37mm gun instead of the original British 2-pounder from the original Daimler turret, while a secondary turret is fitted at the front with a light machine gun, and there is a light machine gun in some of these pictures on top of the main turret. Additional armour also appears to have been fitted, and the fighting compartment is now enclosed, providing much better protection from small arms fire, though it will still be vulnerable to enemy anti-tank guns, while its original top speed is 42 mph or 68 km/h, though the mobility and acceleration will likely be slowed due to the additional weight of the turret and armour, while a crew of 4 seems likely, with a driver, machine gunner in the frontal turret and 2 in the Daimler turret. Overall, this would make for a good 1.3 armoured car, being an extremely unique design, while having a decent main armament, and a turret unlike most half-track designs, and this would be a vehicle I would definitely want to see in the Israeli tech tree. Lastly, for armoured cars, we have the T-17E1 Staghound, which was an American armoured car but was never actually used by American forces, instead being built for other nations like the UK. Now, Israel originally tried to acquire 50 of these in January 1948, so before Israel's independence, but either due to ultimately not being ordered or the arms embargo, these armoured cars were not available during the First Arab-Israeli War. However, Israel would acquire 112 of these vehicles between December 1951 and early 1953, but these were demilitarised and as such were not fitted with 37mm guns or radios, and only 9 of the vehicles were fitted with 37mm guns by 1955. But in this year, a further 100 guns were acquired, enough for nearly all of the Staghounds. Now, the 37mm gun performs pretty well at the low tiers in game, having a penetration of 65mm at 500m with its stock AP shell, or 73mm with its APC-BC shell, though these are all solid shells and as such post-penetration damage is limited, while 2 30 cal machine guns are also carried, one in the coaxial position and one in the bow. Armour is naturally light, ranging from 12 to 32mm, so you will need to avoid stand-up fights, though a smoke mortar was originally fitted to provide some concealment, but I'm unsure if this was available in Israeli service. It is also pretty fast, having a top speed of 56 mph or 90 km/h from 2 97 horsepower engines, while having 4 forward gears and 1 reverse and 4-wheel drive, while a crew of 4 or 5 manned the vehicle. In-game, this could be added at 1.3, giving us a fast armoured car with a hard-hitting, quick-firing weapon, making this well suited to scouting and flanking attacks in the lower tiers. In real life, despite now having a good number of these vehicles available, they were quickly superseded by the far more capable French AMX-13 light tanks. So while these armoured cars were in service during the Suez Crisis of 1956, they don't appear to have seen any combat, and 68 were sold to Nicaragua in 1957, which caught the United States by surprise and sparked fears of a minor arms race in Central America, which kind of surprised me. Though it seems that Nicaragua quickly sold some of these to Cuba, and one still survives in Israel as a museum exhibit. So that's about it for this episode looking at Israeli World War II tanks, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on these tanks and any others you would like me to cover in the comments below. This was a bit of a hard episode to structure and decide what to cover, as there are many more vehicles based on World War II tank chassis that the Israeli used, but fitted with armaments or features that are more at home in the Cold War. So we will probably see some familiar vehicles when we look at Israeli Cold War tanks. But with all of the main nations covered, it is time to go back and look at the SPGs and armoured cars from previously covered nations, which I might do for the next episode, or I might quickly cover Hungarian tanks first, but we shall see. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.